In politics, campaign advertising is the use of an advertising campaign through the media to influence political debate, and ultimately, voters. These ads are designed by political consultants and political campaign staff. Many countries restrict the use of broadcast media to broadcast political messaging. In the EU, many countries do not permit paid-for TV or radio advertising for fear that wealthy groups will gain control of airtime, making fair play impossible, and distort the political debate in the process. In both the United Kingdom and Ireland, paid advertisements are forbidden, though political parties are allowed a small number of party political broadcasts in the run-up to election time. The United States has a very free market for broadcast political messaging. Canada allows paid-for political broadcasts but requires equitable access to the airwaves. Campaigns can include several different media. The time span over which political campaign advertising is possible varies greatly from country to country, with campaigns in the United States lasting a year or more to places like the UK and Ireland where advertising is restricted by law to just a short period of weeks before the election. Social media has become very important in political messaging, making it possible to message larger groups of constituents with very little physical effort or expense. But the totality of messaging through these channels is often out of the hands of campaign managers. History. Political advertising has changed drastically over the last several decades. In the 1948 presidential campaign, Harry S. Truman was proud of his accomplishment of shaking approximately 500,000 hands and covering 31,000 miles of ground across the nation. But that accomplishment was soon to pale in comparison when in 1952, the next presidential election saw a major change in how candidates reached the potential audiences. With the advent of television, war hero and presidential candidate Dwight D. Eisenhower created 40 20-second television spot commercials entitled, "Eisenhower Answers America," where he answered questions from ordinary citizens in an attempt to appear accessible to the common man. Quote, "These questions were filmed in one day using visitors to Radio City Music Hall, who were filmed gazing up at Eisenhower as he answered questions about the Korean War, government corruption, and the state of the economy. He didn't have to shake 500,000 hands or travel the country extensively. He won the trust of the American people with his direct approach and subsequently the presidential election." His vice president was Richard M. Nixon. In 1960, Vice President Nixon used a formal television address in his presidential campaign, designed to answer questions about the Cold War and government corruption, and to show Americans that he was the stronger, more experienced candidate. On the other side of the fence, Catholic-born John F. Kennedy created approximately 200 commercials during his campaign, but there were two that made Nixon's efforts futile. The first was a 30-minute commercial created from a speech he delivered in Houston, where he called for religious tolerance in response to criticism that Catholicism was incompatible with a run for the Oval Office. The second and more memorable was the first Kennedy-Nixon debate. In the first of 4 televised debates, Kennedy appeared tanned and confident in opposition to Nixon, who looked pale and uncomfortable in front of the camera. 75 million viewers watched the debates, and although Nixon was initially thought to be the natural successor to Eisenhower, the election results proved otherwise, and Kennedy was ultimately declared the winner. In 1964, aggressive advertising paved paved the way for a landslide Johnson victory. One of the first negative and maybe the most controversial commercial, perhaps of all time, was an advertisement dubbed the Daisy Girl. The commercial showed a young girl picking the petals off a daisy. After she finishes counting, a voice off camera begins a countdown to a nuclear explosion. The ad ends with an appeal to vote Johnson, because the stakes are too high for you to stay home. The commercial used fear and guilt, an effective advertising principle, to make people take action to protect the next generation. The ad ran for under a minute and only aired once, but due to the right-wing, pro-war views of the Republican candidate, it resulted in a 44-6 state victory for Lyndon B. Johnson. Over the next decade, America saw the rise of the televised political attack ad. Richard M. Nixon was especially proficient at this form of advertising, and his commercials proved to be very successful in his re-election campaign of 1972, where he won handily with a 49-1 state victory. George McGovern ran a campaign free of political attack ads until the very end of his campaign, when he tried to attack Nixon after he realized he was dipping low in the polls. His attempt proved to be too late, but his neutral style of attack ads against Nixon, featuring white text scrolling across a black background, became what is now seen as a fairly common method used in political and product advertising. Attack ads continued to become the norm in political advertising. Ronald Reagan used them against Jimmy Carter in 1980, and it was also the first time that a family member was also used to attack the opposing candidate. One particular advertisement showed Reagan's wife Nancy accusing Carter of a weak foreign policy. This campaign also saw the rise of campaign finance issues when Reagan used political action committees to solicit funds on his behalf. However, in his re-election bid in 1984, we saw the beginning of a different form of political advertising, one with a much more positive flow and a stronger, more powerful message. With the country in a relatively prosperous state, advertisements in support of Reagan evoked an emotional bond between the country and its president. Visions of Americans going about their daily lives with relative ease were compiled to convince America that voting against Reagan was a vote against prosperity. The positive and emotionally provocative ads proved more successful than negative attack ads. He was so highly successful that he won against Walter Mondale with a 49-1 state victory. In the following election, attack ads returned with a renewed vigor. In 1988, George H. W. Bush used campaign ads that ridiculed his opponent, making him appear soft on crime. He contrasted these negative ads with the emotional style commercial used by Ronald Reagan to capitalize on his connection to the former president. Again borrowing from Reagan's campaign practices, he used free publicity as often as possible, making sure he was photographed in various situations that were likely to be aired in the evening news. Although Michael Dukakis tried to discredit the Bush campaign in many ways, he was ultimately unsuccessful, losing to the former vice president by 30 states. Regulation of campaign advertising. United States of America. While there have been some increases in regulation of campaign finance in the United States, there is generally little regulation of political advertising content. The Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002 addressed the issue of soft-in money, or money contributed through political action committees, raised the legal limits of hard money that could be raised for any candidate, and set limits on what funds could be spent on election broadcasts. But it did not mandate verifiability in political campaign advertising. As of this time, there is no pending legislation addressing this issue. Currently, the Federal Communications Commission requires that the contracts for political ads shown on broadcast stations be posted online, but the agency is considering a proposal to expand that disclosure requirement to other platforms, including radio and cable. European Union. In most EU member states, campaign advertising is heavily regulated. In some member states, the United Kingdom and Ireland for example, party political advertisements on broadcast media are restricted to specific circumstances such as political party conferences and a limited time period before a general election. In the latter instance, political parties are allowed specific time slots on the broadcast media in which the advert may be aired. These are limited in time, offered to all registered parties, and must be aired at times during the schedules that have similar levels of viewership. Furthermore, a moratorium on all election coverage is mandated on the day of the ballot. Some member states regulate the posting of election posters at both national and municipal level. In Ireland, there are restrictions on the erection of election posters which mandate the time period after an election by which time the poster must be removed, with fines as a potential sanction. Some local councils have voted to ban the placement of election posters, citing the cost of removal and the waste generated. Many municipalities in France restrict the placement of election posters to specific areas, often erecting stands specifically for that purpose. Turkey. Campaign advertisement for all elections is heavily regulated in Turkey through the 1961 Law on Basic Provisions on Elections and Voter Registers. The Turkish constitution, reformed under Qt regime in 1982, contains a number of restrictions to fundamental civil and political rights directly affecting the conduct of elections. The law on presidential elections, adopted in January 2012, regulates aspects of the new presidential election system. It was adopted in an expedited manner with limited debate and no public consultation or support of opposition parties. OSCE stated in their election report that LPE and Law on Basic Provisions are not harmonized and LPE lacks clarity. Regulation of political advertising. European Union. In contrast to advertising in the print, radio and internet media, many member states of the European Union have consistently restricted advertising on broadcast media which are aimed at political ends. Both party political advertising and political advocacy by non-partisan groups. These restrictions have been justified on the basis that the ban offers a level playing field in which money interests cannot gain an unfair advantage in the political discourse of a member state. The broadcast media has been singled out due to its historical reach and influence. Outright bans on advertising engaged in political advocacy have been referred to the European Court of Human Rights, which has held that such restrictions may be a breach of Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights. But the court has held that restrictions on political advertising can be justified in certain circumstances, provided they were proportionate to the public interest they aim to protect. Certain member states, including the United Kingdom, Ireland and Switzerland, have repeatedly refused to remove the blanket bans. An attempted television ad campaign by the Association Against Industrial Animal Production, which drew a comparison between battery farming and the Holocaust, was persistently refused in line with Swiss law, and was the subject of 2 ECTHR cases. The second case resulting from the persistent refusal by Switzerland to modify its laws on political advertising. However, in a similar UK case involving animal rights advertising, the court upheld the UK ban on political advertising on several grounds. It held the UK had consulted widely before legislating. The court recognised the legitimacy of limiting political advertising on television, acknowledging the argument that there was a risk of distortion of public debate by wealthy groups having unequal access to advertising, and accepted that the ban was not a ban on free speech given that other methods of communication were available. The court thus recognized that television advertising is especially powerful and thus wealthy groups could block out the valid arguments of less wealthy groups and thus distort public debate. India campaigning is done through media's newspapers and radios. By ruling of the Cable Television Network Rules of 1994, political advertisements were prohibited. However, a Supreme Court ruling in 2004 dictated that one may apply for an advertisement to be displayed on TV, but it must be approved by a committee created by the Chief Electoral Officer. The committee consists of the Joint Chief Electoral Officer, a returning officer, and one expert. Additionally, the committee will only consider advertisements from registered political parties or groups or organizations whose headquarters are in the National Capital Territory of Delhi. This model was also spread to other states, there to have a committee consisting of a Joint Chief Electoral Officer, a returning officer, and one expert. Just as with Delhi, the other territories are to consider applications from registered political parties or groups or organizations whose headquarters are in the territory. In all cases, the returning officer is the one who considers applications for advertisements. Additionally, there is a committee within every state, designated by the Chief Electoral Officer, to handle complaints. This committee consists of the Chief Electoral Officer, an observer, and an expert. In addition to these 2004 decisions, it was decided in 2007 that these procedures would be extended national parties for the elections in the states of Gujarat and Himachal Pradesh. The parties are not permitted to take funds from corporate houses and the funds of the parties are non-taxable. The Election Commission, which conducts the election, sets out the rules and regulations for every election and enforces these rules as well. For example, all political parties have to stop campaigning 48 hours before the election. Similarly, politicians facing criminal charges are often disqualified and communal content in speeches are also not permitted. Japan distinguishes between party advertisements and candidate advertisements. There are few restrictions on political advertisements made by parties. One restriction is that party advertisements cannot mention specific candidates. Candidate advertisements have greater limitations and are paid for by the government. Candidates are not allowed to purchase their own advertisements. The number and type of candidate advertisements are also limited, including the size of newspaper advertisements, and length of television and radio advertisements. Japanese election law discourages negative campaign advertising directed at other candidates, parties, or political organizations. Campaign advertisements can only be broadcast during the 2-week official campaign period and are closely monitored for violations of election law. Australia has 5 advertising campaign principles. First, campaigns should be relevant to government responsibilities. Secondly, campaign materials in advertising should be presented in an objective, fair and accessible manner and be designed to meet the objectives of the campaign. Facts presented should be accurate and verifiable. The third principle states that campaign materials should be objective and not directed at promoting party interests. Campaign materials must not mention the party in government by name, or directly attack or scorn the views, policies, or actions of others. Fourth, campaigns should be justified and undertaken in an efficient, effective and relevant manner. The last principle states that campaigns must comply with legal requirements and procurement policies and procedures. This is particularly important in respecting laws with broadcasting and media. When broadcasting political advertisements during an election period, the broadcaster must give all parties contesting the election a reasonable opportunity to have election matter broadcast during the election period. This does not need to be done for free. Sponsors of current affair programs must be identified during political advertising. While Australia does not exactly have a right to free speech, they have an implied freedom of political communication. There are regulations on the format and presentation of political advertising, but little regulation on the content. Iran's democratically elected president, Hassan Rouhani, is the current leader of Iran's quasi-theocratic government. The country is made up of mainly Shiite Muslims and a small minority of Sunni Muslims. The history of censorship in Iranian political advertising and campaign tactics has followed the ebb and flow of the country's religiously conservative state, dating back to the birth of the Islamic regime during the Iranian Revolution of 1979. One of the most recent examples of this censorship dates back to 2007, when Iran's fundamentalist-based parliament passed legislation that severely restricted the content and presentation of political advertising. The restrictions limited candidates in the presidential election from displaying posters, especially with their own image on them, and greatly limited the use of other publicity tools in an effort to urge candidates to give the messages through government organizations. Critics suggest that this limitation of advertising venue and medium was an attempt by the state to keep standing politicians in office and limit the information available on new candidates. Outside reports from more recent elections and campaigns claim actions such as physical attacks on journalists and campaign heads by unknown parties, and the modification of campaign websites and documentaries by state agencies. Argentina passed regulations on the allocation of television and radio campaigns in preparation for the 2013 primary and legislative elections. The regulation divides programming into 4 blocks throughout the day and allocates a certain percentage of time during the slots for campaign advertisement. For television during the blocks from 7 to 11 a.m. and from 4 to 8 p.m., 30% of the time will be allocated to campaign advertisement. For the slots from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. and 8 p.m. to 1 a.m., 20% of the time will be allocated for campaign advertisement. For radio, the percentage of allocation during these 4 time blocks is flipped. 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. and 8 p.m. to 1 a.m. receiving 30% of the time for campaign advertisement, and 20% for the 7 to 11 a.m. and 4 to 8 p.m. time blocks. South Africa. Independent Communication Authority of South Africa, established in 2000, is the regulatory body of broadcast political advertisements. It also serves to protect the message of the political advertisement from the broadcasting service. ICASA's regulations dictate the nature and acceptable content for aired political advertisements. Political party advertisements may only be authorized to be broadcast during the period of elections. A broadcasting service that airs a licensed ad must clearly state that this is in fact a political advertisement. The commercial cannot be longer than 1 minute in duration and cannot exceed 8 time slots within the designated period of elections. There is a required screening process of all political advertisements before being nationally redistributed. Failure to comply with these restrictions will result in maximum fine of 1 million rand. Russia, as well as many other countries, does not have a legal definition of political advertising. Current Russian legislation regulates the form of political advertising such as election campaigns. This form involves activities to disseminate information about political forces and candidates to influence voting behavior. Election campaign is defined as paid by a candidate, an electoral association, or other person acting in the interest of the candidate. Messages and materials which encourage citizens to make the proposed action. Political advertising in a broad sense is not regulated by a special law and follows the general rules governing freedom of speech, freedom of information, and freedom of association. Lack of legal definition of political advertising leads to the ambiguity of its understanding, which generates conflict situations in legal relations of advertising. Moreover, this kind of advertising in Russia has evolved relatively recently, because from 1917 to 1991 there was only one political force in the country, which had no political opponents, and used ideological propaganda as the primary means of political communication. Canada. According to the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, the key role of broadcasters is to inform potential voters on issues, political parties and candidates during an election period. This means ensuring equitable airtime for all candidates on each broadcast network. 6.5 hours of prime programming should be available for the purchase by all parties. On-air personalities running as a candidate in a provincial or federal election are required to halt any on-air duties as soon as her candidacy is announced to the election is called. According to Elections Ontario, there are restrictions regarding when political advertising may be aired and restrictions on the rates broadcasters and publishing facilities can charge for said advertising.